One who is not present today who wants to hear the conversation can watch it on their own time. And Nicole Aandahl, I will ask you to introduce yourself and let us know who you are and your expertise, and then we'll jump right into it.
Yeah, sure. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Nicole Breland Aandahl, as you probably know, Tiffany and I go way back. I'm originally from New York. My family moved to Cleveland when I was 11, to Shaker Heights. I'm a graduate of Howard University. I have a bachelor's in Russian studies. I graduated in 95. And then I also have a law degree from the University of Pittsburgh. And I have, interestingly, a master's in public health and public mental health policy from George Washington University, because I got very involved in suicide prevention advocacy after my brother died by suicide. So those are the formal credentials in terms of schooling. I had a kind of I always like to joke and say I have a more Gen Z career than a Gen X career, and that I like to move around a lot in my career. So I started in government, working in non-proliferation and WMD, weapons of mass destruction, prevention for the Departments of Energy and the Departments of Defense. I spent a significant amount of time both as a student and as a government employee in Eastern Europe. Particularly, I went to a semester of law school in Donetsk, Ukraine, in the eastern part of Ukraine, and have been pretty much every country that hates Russia and have actually not been in Russia, even though I speak Russian. So that's a kind of an interesting combo there. And I then left government, ended up working in the defense industry, also in the area of non-proliferation, export control policy, and then kind of moved up into broader roles of senior management. And then I went through a very 2-year process of a midlife crisis and kind of moved my way out of weapons sales and things of that nature, and took a job with the think tank in DC called the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I took on the role of leading their diversity and leadership program. And then last fall, I was promoted to Senior Vice President of People and Culture, which means I have both the human resources function and the diversity program under my umbrella. And I also do write for the Center on areas of national security and foreign policy. So it's a great environment for me to really kind of settle into the second half of my career, I guess you would call it. And so Tiff reached out to me today, or Dr. Rush reached out to me to have a conversation about my experiences in Eastern Europe, in particular, my experiences as a Black woman in Eastern Europe. And then I figured I'd talk a little bit about this, putting some clarity around identity issues in Ukraine in particular. There's a lot of discussion about Ukraine and where it sits in, not just in kind of global space, but also its relationship vis-a-vis Russia. Lots of questions related to how Ukrainians feel about themselves, and what does this mean for Ukrainians of a generation that have lived their lives kind of free of Russia, and kind of how it's playing out intergenerationally right now in Ukraine. You still have people that are World War II survivors. So there's a lot of history that's kind of unfolding in real time before our eyes. So with that, that's the intro.
Go right in.
Okay. And please, I'm open to questions. I'm an attorney. I'm used to being interrupted constantly. So feel free to, interrupt me with any questions, and I'm happy to answer them as they come up.
Well, I can start with this one. Why did Russia invade Ukraine?
So it's really interesting. And I can give a little history lesson here if that's helpful. So the area that we know as Russia has had really interesting borders over the last couple of years, and the area known as Ukraine has had very interesting borders over the last few hundred years. Ukraine kind of sits, geographically between Russia, to the east, there is to the south, kind of across the Black Sea, or heading toward, your Asian, kind of Central Asia area. And then obviously to the west is Western Europe. To the north, they've got Scandinavia. And so because they have a very strategic geographic location, they've been invaded many, many times. They were first invaded by by Mongolia, gosh, 17th century, I don't remember. But then more recently, they were kind of swallowed by Imperial Russia under the Tsarist system, where the Russians saw that they wanted more control over that region because of the climate and the location and the territory. So Ukraine is frequently referred to as the breadbasket of Eastern Europe. They have a climate that's just perfect for growing wheat and corn and kind of staple products, right? So they were always a supplier to Russia, and they also kind of supply the general Black Sea region, north and south. Imperial Russia, because they saw Ukraine as a strategic opportunity, created a narrative whereby they pushed forward this idea that Ukrainians are actually Russians, that they're not a distinct ethnic or national group, which is interesting because, there was at one point a region known as the Kiev Rus, which was a loosely governed Ukrainian region that kind of pushed, Ukraine's borders a little bit east, closer to Russia. But the Tsars, again, saw that region and that territory as too valuable of an opportunity to let them be independent. They pushed their way into Eastern Ukraine. And just, if you can see in your head, Ukraine is kind of like this, kind of like shaped like this. And in the kind of the eastern third, it's split by a river called the Dnieper River. And so Russia pushed its borders pretty much right up to that river. So east of that river in Ukraine to this day is Russian speaking. Okay, they're ethnically Ukrainian, but Russian speaking. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So that was under the Tsars. When
Do you
the
want me
Russian
to have a
Revolution,
map up here for you, Nick?
I'm sorry?
Would that be helpful? Do you want a map? You can see a
Sure.
map.
Yeah, so there's your map. So you see, and I can speak a little bit to these regions, but you see that river that kind of splits off that back third of the country, kind of snakes through. That's the Dnieper River, Dniper. Kiev, as you can see, is kind of sits right in the north center of the country. And then some of the strategic areas where the Russians have they have attacked from all sides. So they're coming up through the Black Sea, they're coming from the east. That region where you see, can you see Donetsk, kind of in the south?
Here?
Yeah, the southeastern corner. They've occupied this area since 2018 already, but they are now trying to push farther west. They want to take the entire country. Okay, so when the Soviet Union in 1918, it was a time of great instability in the region because they only took over in Russia, but they kicked out all of the Tsarist class, all of that leisure class, they called it. So there was no longer Russian leadership in Ukraine at that point. A Ukrainian national movement sprung up. A new state was created, the Ukraine, I can't remember the name of the country, but a brand new Ukraine was established in 1919. And they were internationally recognized as an independent country at that time. But then again, the Bolsheviks did not want to let go of this very strategically important region. So there was a war that went on in Ukraine for about 4 years, a civil war. And the Bolsheviks eventually prevailed and created the Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic. And that was in like around 1920, 1922. And so now, yet again, Ukraine is part of Russia in the mind of Russia. It's really interesting. Nikita Khrushchev was Ukrainian. The Soviet premier, which actually came from Ukraine. And, again, you had a country that was forced to speak Russian. They were forced to give up their religion. They were forced to give up their Ukrainian citizenship in favor of Soviet citizenship. So when the next revolution happened and the wall came down and the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, all of those republics that had been swallowed by the Soviet Union were again given their independence. Ukraine again was an independent country. And at that time, they took some measures to kind of reclaim their national identity and heritage. They made Ukrainian the national language of the law. They reestablished the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Catholic Church. They were a true democracy. So they became a true democracy, I'll say, and reestablished self-rule. The problem from Russia's point of view, and I say Russia, I mean Putin, okay? So let's be really clear. This is not necessarily the view of most Russian people. From Putin's perspective, the fact that Ukraine has been very openly courting the West in terms of wanting to orient more towards the West and less towards Moscow, that has been a particular problem for Putin, because hold on one second, we have a toilet paper crisis. Sorry about that. So from Putin's perspective, he is again reviving this more Russian imperial view of Ukraine being Russian territory. And the fact that they do not want to be part of Russia for him is particularly problematic.
So why invade now?
There are a lot of theories about that. And I can just kind of throw out a few theories. One is that he sees the United States and NATO as particularly weak due to the way we exited Afghanistan. That's one theory. Another theory is that he is feeling the pinch domestically and needs to wag the dog a little bit, if that makes sense. Another theory is that he's losing it and that this is kind of his, they call it the suicide mission. That's a theory. Another theory is that, and I think this is probably one of the most credible ones, that he really is, Putin's a Russian nationalist and is very nostalgic for the eras where Russia was the dominating force in their region. And he feels as if they are no longer respected and seen as dominant. Now, that's a really interesting view, given that no one expected the fight to go on this long with, especially with, assessments of Russia's military. There has been a lot written in the last few years about how the military is really modernized, how he's really cleaned it up. The Russian military used to have huge problems with substance abuse, HIV, tuberculosis, morale was low. And he really put some investment into revitalizing the military. And then there was the other view that Ukraine's military was not strong enough to stand up to Russia. Well, what we see is that the Ukrainians are putting up one hell of a fight. And it's not been as so easy for Russia to just take over. So they're engaging in tactics that the international community is condemning. It's been alleged that he's using cluster munitions. He's definitely attacked civilian sites. There is some concern over the use of biological and chemical weapons. I think the bombing of the maternity hospital and stating that it was actually a strategic strike, it's not sitting well with anybody. So again, there are a lot of different views that he is in an even weaker position right now than he was when he started this war. Especially since he is now openly courting Chechen and Syrian conscripts to come help the Russians fight on the ground.
Having a background in law and in US government and also in mental health, what concerns do you have for the normal, everyday, average person in Ukraine and in Russia?
Yeah, I'll address those separately because there are two. I will start with the Russians. Russia has been, and this again, this is Putin, has become more and more isolated over the last 5 or 6 years. Access to information has been limited. The media is tightly controlled. There have been more arrests for political reasons in the last 5 or 6 years. Obviously, the poisoning of Russian dissidents abroad, like Navalny, for example, who's now sitting in a Russian prison again when he went back home. And so they've been seeing their universe kind of shrink. Russians have, over the last 2 decades, become accustomed to a certain lifestyle, which is heavily reliant on access to the West. Western media, Western products, international cultural exchange, Western companies inside Russia. They identify themselves as obviously more Anglo-Caucasian, and so they definitely look to countries like the UK, France, and the US in terms of how they orient their culture. And so their access to our stuff is cut off. And even Starbucks and McDonald's is closing. Companies are pulling out. They're not able to get to their money. Obviously, they're not able to consume our entertainment. And so I could imagine that they are feeling quite unsettled about all of this. Now, because it's such a closed society, you'll see there were tens of thousands of Russians protesting against Putin's actions. A good chunk of those people have been arrested, and indefinitely, I would suspect. He keeps his distance from everyone, even the people that are closest to him. He doesn't trust anybody. He tightly controls the political process in the country. I personally think things are ripe for some type of civil action inside Russia, but I don't know. I'm deeply concerned about Russian citizens and, this major disruption to their kind of world standing, I could imagine is quite disabling. It would be interesting to know who they blame for that. Okay, Maddie.
Everybody has kids.
Yeah.
Get it? Kids are kids.
I have an 8-year-old boy and a 10-year-old daughter, so you can imagine what that dynamic is like. So I'm quite concerned in that I think that the conditions are ripe for perhaps laying blame where it does not belong.
Okay.
Not with their leadership, but perhaps with America, perhaps with immigrants, perhaps with religious and ethnic minorities, kind of the old playbook.
Okay.
And then for Ukrainians, for the generation that was born, I'll say post 1988, they don't know anything other than independence. They do not, I mean, even I was in Eastern Ukraine. Again, this is the Russian speaking part of Ukraine. They strongly identify as Ukrainian there. The limitation of their language did not reflect the sense of self. They were very, very strong in their sense of self. They were really focused on regaining their Ukrainian identity. And so to be, again, kind of erased is deeply unsettling for most Ukrainians. I've been in touch with quite a few of my friends. Unfortunately, it's gone dark in the last couple of days. I don't know how they're doing, but for them right now, their main concern is staying safe and alive and having food and water and shelter. But at the same time, there is a lot of anger. And that in turn can also, on the flip side, stoke, I'd say, a growing Ukrainian nationalist movement, which tends to veer into territory that's not the best sometimes in terms of racial identity and things of that nature. So, I think it's positive that Zelensky has provided incredible leadership during, and Zelensky being the president of Ukraine has shown incredible resilience and has demonstrated every quality you would hope to see in a leader during a time of crisis. I think he's been a real beacon for the Ukrainian people. He's handling the Russian misinformation very, very skillfully. I mean, it's really funny that Russia's, one of Putin's premises for invading Ukraine was to denazify the country when both the president and the prime minister are Jewish. It's just kind of mind-blowing.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, so there's, I think Ukraine's controlling the narrative right now, which is important. I think, again, that gives his people a lot of hope, but obviously, I wish I could show some pictures from that my friends have sent me from the shelters where they are in Poland, and other places. But it's almost as if for those individuals who are, under 30 or over, 30 years old or younger, it would be like somebody invading Canada. I mean, they've known nothing but freedom. So now that's not true for the eastern part of the country where Russia moved in a couple of years ago. But definitely west of the Dnieper River, this is extraordinary. They don't know conflict. It's not like, Syria or or, Yemen or Afghanistan, where there have been these long standing wars.
Right. So
I mean,
essentially,
I was going to say, it'd also be like, hey, guys, excuse me. I was going to say, I think an equivalent would be like Vietnam,
Mhm.
A place that was under communist control, that was, a totalitarian government.
I don't know, it's a meeting.
For so long.
Go ahead. Okay, so essentially what you're saying is this is a group of people who were living peacefully, living independently, and then all of a sudden things changed.
Yes. It's, I think that this particular type of trauma, I mean, again, you have like these different, so for the older generation, either that remembers living under the Soviet
The
Union,
Soviet,
for them that may have experienced, now, because the Soviets rolled in to Ukraine in the 20s, there are not many people who remember that part. But they do remember the feeling of being free of the Soviet Union. So, that kind of exhale is something where, they really rolled up their sleeves and tried to do something in the country to make it a better place. And to see that just taken away from them is disruptive. For the younger people, again, they've never known anything other than, I mean, it's like any other type of trauma where, the school shooting or something like that, where it's just like instantly your whole sense of self and place in the world and safety is just, blown up.
Yeah.
It's interesting though to see what the reaction is in other parts of the former communist world, like Czech Republic. Those people remember Soviet tanks rolling into their cities. They remember that because that was in like 54. And then, the kind of the conflict in Czechoslovakia, which was at the time Czechoslovakia, rolled into the late 60s. So they remember that. Czech Republic they are Poland too, right? Like they are extremely frightened that they're going to be next. And so are the Baltic states. They are, Georgia, where the Russians waged a war a couple of years ago and took more territory of Georgia. They're mortified because they see this as the beginning.
Of
The
a
entire
repeat.
region is destabilized right now.
And by
And everyone's
destabilized,
afraid that Putin is going to use some type of weaponry that's not been used since World War II. I mean, there's concern about nuclear, they are a nuclear country, and the entire premise for him invading Ukraine was that they posed a threat to Russia's sovereignty and national security. So, he's thrown up this idea about using nuclear weapons. And, that's part of why there's this hesitation on doing any further action, like, establishing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, for example, which would require us to directly engage with Russia militarily. They do not want to poke this bear any more than they have to. I think the US and NATO and the EU are doing everything they can right up to direct military engagement with the Russians, because he rarely, you can't call his bluff.
So knowing that you have a history of working for the government, I'm not asking you in the capacity of a government person, I'm asking you as just a private citizen. How concerned are you about other countries engaging Russia in this escalating further?
I'm not that worried. I don't think anyone wants to do that. I mean, again, what happens if Russia hits Polish territory?
Mhm.
What happens if he hits Estonian territory? Those are NATO countries.
Mhm.
I don't see how you avoid, right? The minute they cross that line, those countries have the right to defend themselves, however they see fit. So I suspect Russia's being very careful about that as well. But mistakes happen. So, what happens? Again, I think everyone is extremely cognizant that we are on the edge of the first major global conflict of the 21st century, and of a level that we've not seen since 1939. And nobody wants that, because all of these countries are very happy being very rich. And they don't want, I mean, China, for example, I personally do not believe that China wants to engage in any type of war. It would be too destabilizing for them.
Mhm.
So they're kind of walking that fine line. Now, there are reports that they're kind of pushing out Russian propaganda about what's happening on the ground there. But they keep treading this line. They're like, we support national integrity and sovereignty, but we're kind of here for you, Putin. So it's kind of a weird, they're kind of walking a fine line there. Another country walking a fine line is India. Their military has been greatly funded and improved by Russia. They have Russian equipment, Russian weapons, Russian training.
Mhm.
So they are also kind of walking a very fine line. Other countries are just openly supportive, like Belarus. Oh, just fun fact, Bielo means white. So Belarus literally means white Russia.
Yeah.
And then, a few other places that don't, I mean, Turkey's been pretty quiet
Mhm.
and they're NATO. So, yeah. Oh, Moldova's also worried about the Russians moving into Moldova.
So based on what you said, it sounds like you don't think this necessarily will escalate further and involve more countries
I
or
think
more NATO response.
I think that is up to Russia's act. It depends on what Russia does.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So this has been on my heart, and I've literally been trying to research it, and I can't get a clear-cut answer to the question. I think one of the things that I think about, when we hear on the news about how the United States is pulling our resources out away from Putin, right? But in mental health, when I think about, and I have worked with narcissistic behavior, I think that behavior has no limit. I think we learned that back when Rocky came out, when he said, if he dies, he dies. So that's my mind frame. Like, does he have the ability? And I'm trying to figure this out. If he decides to say, I want it all, right? That narcissistic thought. I'm this level of arrogant that I want everything. And since the United States of America decided to take away McDonald's and Starbucks, I hear that he has some type of weapons of mass destruction that can destroy us all. I need that one simple question to be dispelled. Does he have the power or the equipment to destroy us all if people decide to not conform to what it is that he wants?
I don't know too much about what their strategic capability is. I know more generally what ours is. you know, first to his personality, let me just show you, let's see if I can pull this up. I mean, like, this is the guy you're talking about.
Yes, I've seen those pictures before. Mhm.
There's if you ever want to just kind of take a little bit of comic relief from all of this, there's a lot of fun stuff, like lots of urban legends about him and how he lives and, you know, his daily routine. Mine is, you know, there are more of him than we think there are. When one gets tired, you can just cycle out and put the next one up. But again, that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about there being concern about his mental state. But I do have confidence in our defense capability. You know, we have a very robust system that would be able, in my opinion, we would be able to prevail. But again, like the process of getting there would be pretty awful. But we have a very strong missile defense. I mean, we are able to take things out when they are en route. Yeah, I can't speak too much to that because I just don't really know that much about that. But I will say that I am not personally concerned about any type of catastrophic incident reaching our shores that of a conventional nature.
Okay.
Of a conventional nature. I'll just put it that way.
I have a question for the attorney part of you. Do you see an influx of Ukrainian refugees coming into North America?
I think so. You know, we have a really sizable Ukrainian American population in the United States. Also, I learned today that Edmonton has a huge Ukrainian Canadian population. So I perceive that we will see not the numbers we've seen from Afghanistan. So we have a lot of Afghan refugees in the United States now in the tens of thousands. So it would, I think, further, I don't think it would impact our ability to provide humanitarian relief in this country in the same way it has for folks coming from Afghanistan, because a lot of Ukrainians have family here, friends here, other people that can receive them. And then just Ukrainian organizations and whatnot are pretty well funded and supported here in the US. But there is some concern about unaccompanied minors. I've heard that there's concern about trafficking, obviously, of minors. I've heard concerns about sexual violence, particularly at the refugee sites. Though, unlike Afghanistan, most of these refugee sites are filled with women because the men have stayed behind. So I think there's a little bit less risk of that. But predators come in all forms, right? But I think we will see. I think we will see more people coming to the US in the next year or so. It's going to be hard for people to get here because I don't think we're doing, again, like the types of airlifts that we did out of Kabul for people. They'll have to kind of make it here on their own.
Okay. So then here's the question for the public health piece of you. What types of things do mental health providers or healthcare providers in general really need to know about people from Ukraine, and where might we go to learn specifics?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are a couple of books what I'll do is I'll put together a list of books and resources after this call
Mhm.
to learn about the culture, to learn about the history, kind of like family structure, I think is another one to look into. You could definitely reach out to some of these organizations. The Ukrainian Catholic Church is pretty robust here in the US as well.
Mhm.
I mean, generally, as a society, it's pretty similar to the United States in terms of the number of, so-called intact families and divorced families, single parents, things of that nature. There are a fair number of orphans in Ukraine, mostly due to, parents having specific issues related to substance abuse or other types of situations. There are a fair number of biracial children in those orphanages as well. So yeah, I can think of a couple of books and definitely speaking to these organizations and going to their sites. But I would say particularly because you had so many, traditional intact families now broken apart under traumatic circumstances, I suspect that's probably going to be one of the top issues. I'm worried about dad.
And the predominant language in Ukraine is
Ukrainian in the West and Russian in the East. So if you have people coming from Kharkiv, from Odessa, from Donetsk, they're going to likely be Russian speakers. If you have them coming from the Western part of the country, they're going to be Ukrainian speakers. Some of the older people do speak Russian, they just refuse to.
all right. What questions does anybody else have? I don't want to dominate all the conversation.
I just would like to appreciate this seminar, this webinar, because I'm Ukrainian actually, and it was really interesting. I know all this what you said, but it was interesting to hear from you. Yeah. Also, I was born like in 1989, and it's really crazy for me to listen about this Russian national movements, about this Soviet time ambitions, like to reunite again Soviet Union. It's really very strange for me, because we are really born and live in freedom. So yeah. Sorry, it's just my child.
Okay.
Okay, everybody understands.
Привет. Привет.
Yeah. What else? Also, I'm a little bit concerned about all this anger and hatred, which is coming. Which is coming from Ukrainian to Russians, because actually, I understand that how propaganda is working. So a lot of Russians are now really like brainwashed. But they are writing so many sometimes terrible comments, and it's real people, and it's difficult in this time, I think, for Ukrainian people to react without this hate and anger. And this also, I'm a little bit concerned how to work with this when you consult people, because it's so high aggression and high hatred, which you cannot really manage. You cannot like a specialist, and cannot justify, because Russians are brainwashed and Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom, and it's difficult situation really from mental health,
Yes.
It is. I mean, I think about that a lot, right? Because it's really, you can very intellectually say, oh, it's not Russians, it's Putin, right? And you can kind of say it's not, but when you're kind of in real time, in a crisis, I don't know if that's too much to ask of people to make that kind of distinction. I don't know if it takes time to get there. I'm not a mental health professional, so I don't know, but yeah, I mean, and I think, at least in the US, and to the extent I was able to communicate with friends in Russia up until a few days ago, it's really interesting. Like their perspective is they don't understand why this is happening. They are, and they're frustrated because they were able to provide, they want to provide real accurate information to their friends and family back home, but they know that puts their friends and family back home at risk. So that's part of the problem with the information that's being circulated in Russia right now, is that they aren't getting accurate information about what's happening. And I can imagine that just creates even more, again, like Zelensky's doing an incredible job controlling the narrative internationally, but that messaging is not getting back, to the average Russian citizen in Russia. And even to some extent, I know there's some issues of that kind of creeping in even into like Kazakhstan right now. So it's just, I'd be really interested to hear exactly if Russians are feeling isolated. They've got to, because because you have this prevailing global narrative about how awful what's happening is, they've got to feel pretty isolated and like vilified.
No, I just I was living during 3 years in Russia, in St. Petersburg, and people are really very good and nice, but only 15% of Russian population was traveling abroad, and it's mostly people from Moscow and St. Petersburg, and most of population, they have never been traveling, and they really like believing only what they see on TV. And I think they are somehow isolated. And also now we have many friends in Russia, and they want to leave Russia because they are afraid what is going on and how it will be. But at the same time, all over the world, many people also start now like to hate Russians somehow. Of course, they hate Putin mostly, but and it's also difficult for them to move away, because they're also afraid that they will be judged, and that's also create. But yeah, I believe that most of population support maybe these actions because they have never been outside, and they're really brainwashed somehow.
Yeah, no, I know. And it's like kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, like they've been really kind of shrinking the orbit of information in Russia for the last 5 or 6 years, shutting down independent newspapers, media stations, prohibiting import of international media, for example. And so that bubble has been shrinking, and yeah, I'm sure I think there was recently a poll that was conducted in Russia about kind of worldview, but they've had the narrative controlled by someone, by a leader, by Putin, who's a Russian nationalist. So it's a very dangerous situation.
In these last couple of minutes, I have one comment and one question, and if anyone else has a quick question, we can take that too. There has been some coverage of how social media has had an impact on Ukraine. For instance, people in the States are booking Airbnbs for same day so that the money goes directly to someone in Ukraine so that they can filter the money and do what needs to be done with it there from private citizens. With that in mind, I'm wondering, emotionally, the people that you know in Ukraine, to the extent that you've been able to communicate with them, how are they doing? What kind of stuff do they need if they are still there?
It changes every day.
Mhm.
You know, I'd say up until about 3 days ago, my friends in Kiev, for example, they still had access to food. They still had access to water. That's from what I understand, because I've not been able to talk to anybody for the last couple of days. I believe that's been cut off.
Mhm.
And there is a strong, either depending on where you are, there's a strong on the ground military presence in or around where people are living. Other parts of the infrastructure have been hit. So, you know, at this point, I think people need, depending on where they need almost everything. I mean, I think people in a lot of areas just need water.
Mhm.
It's still winter there. It's still very cold. You know, I think other things, my daughter, she's collecting hair accessories for girls
Mhm.
to send, you know, headbands and bows and, you know, things like that. Another charity's doing feminine products,
Mhm.
you know, so, but there are so many, I mean, apparently once you get over the border in Poland, there's a tent for every international aid organization on the planet. There's even a tent for the State Department helping people with visas, I believe. I mean, it's just, they are, for the people that have made it out, they have some access to things that they need. For people that are still in country, they need everything. I mean, I haven't seen, like, again, I haven't seen any flags up today, but you know, they're definitely shutting off the water. Russia disconnected the internet, and yeah, it's just not good on the ground there. And I think obviously there's continued trauma there. You know, some areas I know they hear gunfire and explosions day and night. And then the other, I guess, yeah, that's the other piece I thought. There is a fairly large elderly population in Ukraine that are unable to move. You know, I have friends whose parents are still in Donetsk, and they're either too old to move or they don't want to. And I suspect that for those individuals that have family members that are in areas that are under siege, that feeling of helplessness must be debilitating. You know, like even the ability to just even communicate with them being cut off, I think that's just got to be deeply upsetting.
All right. So thank you, Nick. Is there any final question or comment anyone has? Because I see we're at the top of the hour. No? Well, I thank you all for your time, your comments, your patience. And Nicole Aandahl, I thank you, Nicole Breland Aandahl, I thank you so much for spending this hour with us.
Oh,
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Having me. I will talk about my, you know, like beloved Ukraine till I'm blue in the face. So, and Irina, I'm wishing your family the best, and
Thank you. Thank you so much for this webinar.
Yes,
Where
you're
will you
welcome.
share the resources? And just to throw it out there, I know you're going to share books. Is it possible, because you mentioned some social media platforms as well, because I've been seeing some social media, a lot of things from social media, like Putin's house, and that
Oh.
even raised a brow to me as a therapist, like the way his house is closed off and sitting high up on this hill. But any social media information you have, any books, articles, whatever, so that because I'm licensed in Illinois, and we have an actual Ukrainian village
Oh, yes,
in
yes.
Chicago, and we actually, the news was I'm back and forth between here and Florida, but they showed on the news, they brought one, I don't know why it was just one specific Ukrainian woman over, but she just spoke a little. But I'm thinking the state of Illinois is pretty good when things like this happen, with supporting those who need the help. So in the event that I find myself doing any type of mental health services within Ukrainian village, I would like to just be informed on how to work, with the population.
Yeah, I mean, the only accounts I follow on social media those are my friends. So you'll see pictures of like dogs and kids and stuff. But in terms of other resources, I will email them to
Yeah, send it
Tiffany.
to me.
And as they come in, you can definitely keep track. And then my organization has a whole section on what's happening on Ukraine, looks at everything from the humanitarian issues of global food security to defense posture. And so you can follow that one in real time as well.
That's social media?
No, it's my think tank.
Think tank.
Mhm. Yeah.
All right,
I
thank
mean-
you. Oh, go ahead, Nick.
I was just gonna say, there's a lot out there too. It's social media. You just have to,
Be
some of it
careful.
to take with a grain of salt.
So anything that she sends me, I'll post in this trust the process area of the advising forum. And if anybody has any questions for me, please feel free to reach out. Thank you all
Thank
so
you.
much. Yes.
Thank you.
World, human beings, man. Wow.
Yeah.
Somebody's water.
You know what? I was actually interested in that.
Yeah.
If Putin's issue is wanting to take control of Ukraine, and maybe I felt like it was a remedial question, but I wasn't clear. Why is he making his own people suffer? That doesn't make sense for me. Like, if you,
Yeah. It's, if you're looking at kind of the totalitarian mindset, I'll call it, they are there for him, right? Like they are there for him. His people are there for him. That's that mindset. Like, it's not about you. It's about Russia, right? It's not even about me. It's about Mother Russia. That's the narrative. And so I could give a whole other talk about the role of suffering in Russian and Soviet literature. Like, it is a prominent theme,
So does he restrict the people of Russia from not leaving? Like, I know that I don't want to say your name wrong.
Irina?
Yeah, what is it? Irina. When Irina spoke about it, her lived experience, I guess my thought is just like, why are you making your own people suffer? And then at what point do the people, right, because they should outnumber him, at what point do the people begin to retaliate for their own freedom and safety? And is he stopping his people from going outside of Russia? Is this a personal choice of Russians not going out to find out things for themselves? Or is this, again, forced because Putin is saying, no, you're like, it's almost like a authoritative parent. You can't go.
No, if they can go, they just don't.
Okay.
I
You
mean,
don't think that has any brainwashing from him to make?
it could be. I mean, there is a narrative that the rest of the world is hostile to you, Russia. So, it's better for you to stay at home. I mean, I think economics hold a lot of people back from traveling too.
Okay, so it's a
Yeah,
poor.
I mean, like if you look at what people do for a living, I'd say there are kind of two career paths for you in Russia right now. One is working for the government,
Mhm.
and the other is maybe hopefully finding a job in the private sector. But those private sector jobs are not very prevalent. And so you're kind of stuck. I mean, again, organized crime is very well organized in Russia as well. So some people end up unwittingly and sometimes purposefully working for, organized crime. But yeah, there's just I kind of joke, it's like being a New Yorker, like, people who never leave their borough.
Mm.
Or California, people who never leave California. Like,
Yeah.
they're like, why leave California?
Mhm.
California's great. Why would I go anywhere else?
Yeah.
I think that's part of it. But people leave, they travel. Under perestroika, which was back to, if you remember when we were in high school
Mhm.
and people first started kind of immigrate. That's when I started taking Russian, by the way, was in high school,
Mhm.
believe it or not, in like 1989.
Mhm.
Because we had an exchange. No, we had a new student. We had like 2 new students from Russia, right, Tiff? 2 or 3.
I've had a couple of people from Russia.
Yeah. And I was like, you're a real person. This is interesting. Because our entire, we grew up during the Cold War. So Russians were, stern,
Mhm. Lots of
scary,
stereotypes. Yeah.
very deeply stereotyped, large,
Mhm.
just form,
It's interesting.
hated us.
Even Wendy's had commercials about Russians.
Yeah,
Wendy's, the fast food chain.
the Wendy's Russian Soviet fashion show
It was a fashion
commercial
show.
has
Yes.
a favorable mention in my book, Tiff. I had to mention that.
Yeah.
I mean, and then you had Rocky 4, you had Red
Rocky is
Dawn,
with
you had like, oh my gosh. And so I'm like, hey, you're actually a nice person with a cool accent. This is interesting, right? And so, there were large numbers of Russians and Ukrainians coming to the US during that time. And at first it was mostly Jews because they were like, I can leave? Yes, thank you.
yeah.
Mhm.
But then there were other groups that were leaving as well. But yeah, it's just not, they like to consume things that are coming from the West, but you don't see people typically kind of leaving.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to stop us now because we'll continue. But thank you
Yes, we will. Thank
sincerely
you.
for your attendance. And thank you, Nick, for doing this.
Oh, my pleasure.
Everybody have a good evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.